afternoon from wherever you're watching. So my name is Manwara Ali. I am a charity specialist. So I work in charities, 30 years experience in the charity sector, not-for-profit, or as they say, voluntary sector organizations. And I'm currently a chief exec of a small charity. Apart from that, I also deliver leadership training, coaching, and mentoring. So, as promised, I've been coming here every Sunday, live streaming, just spending a few minutes providing some hot tips on bid writing, fundraising for anybody within the voluntary sector, whether you're a CIC, community interest company, that is, or a community organization, voluntary sector organization, or small charity. The reason why I'm doing this, I know that a lot of small charities are really struggling at the moment with the cost of living crisis. A lot of charities that have reached out to me, generally they're struggling to raise funds. And fundraising is a very, very challenging profession to be in. I'm a qualified fundraiser. I've been doing fundraising since, well, at least for the last 31 years. And I know that the challenges are the same for many of you who are perhaps new to fundraising, or run organizations where you don't actually have professional expertise or can't afford a fundraiser. So especially with the very, very small charities, a lot of the trustees end up doing the fundraising. So I thought I'd add some value on LinkedIn, because I have such a huge number of people that are connected to me, like-minded, from similar profession as me, and I wanted to be able to share some of my own learning. And of course, added benefit, if any funders listening, what I talk about is generally my own personal experience of fundraising, bid writing, and also I think sometimes I touch upon the way things are changing, and we need to change our systems and our ways of working. Maybe the systems we had in place once upon a time, before COVID anyway, before 2020, worked, but they all need looking at. And fundraising is one of those professions where a lot of people choose to work from home, or I think beyond the pandemic, organizations are encouraging or recruiting fundraisers that are working from home, working remotely. It can be quite a challenging thing to do as well, to work remotely. And so anyway, I want to today focus on budgets. A few people did reach out to me and say, how do you put together a budget? And I thought that if I cover budgets today, that will give anyone who listens to my live stream an idea of how you go about putting, or what kind of stuff that you need to consider. So here's the thing, every single funder will have a set of guidelines on their website. And an important part of research is also looking at, before you even put a budget together, you need to look at the funder's requirements. Often that's such an obvious thing, but one of the things I discovered being on a funding panel myself. So I've been on the other side of the fence. I have been on a panel where we were giving out grants, and I was a decision maker. And so it gave me an insight during my learning, how sometimes we can think on the other side. It's a huge learning curve, because when you sit on become a decision maker, and how you view things is very different to how the applicant looks at, or the presumptions that are made by small charities, who often will either, the common problem with applications is either they will ask for too much money, or they will not ask for enough. And I know I read something recently, an article that was written by NCVO around organizations not asking for enough money. And of course, there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration in that respect, because if you're an organization that has been running for less than a year, or an organization that's been running for many, many years, but like have never applied for funding before, and you don't really have the right infrastructure in place, you may not have no track record. So it makes it a lot more challenging for you to go to a funder and ask for funding. So I think it's different if your organization's been running for more than a year, because if your organization's been running for more than a year, you'll have a fair idea. Like, you'll know what your running cost has been for the last 1 year. So in that case, like, it's not looking at new figures, putting together new figures for a budget that you have completely no idea about. So I guess, like, differentiating those two things, your position in terms of track record as an organization and your turnover as well. Because if you are, for example, an organization that your turnover is like 40,000 or something, or 100,000, some funders, not all, but some funders will not fund you for more than 50% of your turnover. So if 40,000 is what your turnover has been for the whole year, and you go to a funder and you ask for 150,000, there has to be like a really compelling reason why, because that's a huge expansion. And also it has to be a funder that will fund that kind of in that way. So again, I'm going to go back to what I said in last week's live stream, which was that communication is really important, because until we communicate, we actually have no idea what the funder's expectations are, and the funder has no idea about us either. And this is a very common mistake with small charities. You apply for funding, you complete an application form, and you think you filled in a pretty good application form, right? And you submit it, and you expect the funder to just like fund it because it's been so well written. But it's not about that. There's so many other things that a funding panel will consider, and budget is one of them. Money, finances is like a really important part of it. So I would always say communication is so important, because a funder is judging us on the basis of an application form. So speaking to a grant officer, speaking to the grant funder on the other side of the phone, and really understanding, and also talking and explaining makes a big difference, because sometimes we don't articulate things very well on paper, but actually, or we're going too fast, we haven't got the time, we just barely cut and paste and submit a form because we just want to get it over and done with. And actually, there lies the difference between whether it's going to be a winning bid or it's going to be unsuccessful. So I would say, in terms of budgets, a lot of people don't know how to put budgets together. A good starting point is if you're actually looking at putting, like, if it's the first job role that you want to acquire funding for, like for the first time you want to employ someone, or it's a role where perhaps you already have like a sessional staff and you want to introduce like a management role. A good starting point is to do some research on salary rates, and like salary rates for that particular role. That's usually a very good starting point. So you would look at to see other charities your size, what kind of like rates they tend to pay. Like just Google search itself like brings up lots of things, but it's always useful to speak to like other organizations that are in this area, or if of any other small charities, it's always worth asking somebody if they wouldn't mind sharing, without like sort of asking for too much private information, confidential information about the organization. It's more about, okay, like, would you mind sharing the salary rates? like, or what do you think we should pay for XYZ, for a development manager role, etc. You would normally research that, and you'd be able to find like charity jobs or even guardian jobs. You get a fair idea. You see what rates those jobs are payable. The other thing I would say for salaries when you're putting a budget together is that you need to make sure that the salary includes on costs, that's the national insurance and tax, and also that your salaries include like an inflationary rise, because if, or presumably you will review salaries once every year or 2 years, and if you, when you're applying for 3 years funding, for example, you don't take that into account, you will fall short. And I've been there. I've done that before, where I've applied for funding and actually didn't include the on cost, which meant that we got to a situation where we had a shortfall, and we had to find the money from somewhere because it didn't cover what we employed somebody for those, for that role. It didn't actually cover all the salary for all the time that the project was running. So that's what I would say about salaries. I would say that obviously I've said this in my last week as well. It's so important that fundraiser and the finance are actually working together very closely. Not everybody who does fundraising is going to necessarily be an expert on finance as well, but also two heads are better than one, and it's always worth discussing it with another person, because you get like a second opinion about things. And also your finance person probably has a fair idea about finances, and finance people generally are very smart at putting core costs into budgets. So that's my sort of last point around asking money for running costs. Traditionally, most organizations really struggled to get funding from, trust and foundations for the core running costs. I think during the pandemic and beyond, funders have really reviewed their criteria and have been thinking about how do we try and get the money out to the very smaller groups, the grassroots organizations who need it the most. The problem has always been that grassroots organizations struggle and don't often go to big funders, because they know that their core running costs won't be covered, and funders traditionally were more interested in funding project funding. And obviously, if you don't have the core of your organization covered, just project funding is really not going to help you. And I think some organizations I've worked in the past have fallen foul of that. They've come to a point where all they're doing is project after project, but like sometimes those projects have to be delivered by trustees because they haven't got the funds to employ someone, or sometimes they're really scrimping and like trying to get free venues and things, and that can cause problems, and I think mistrust sometimes, and makes collaboration so much more harder, because the organizations that you are actually trying to get like a free venue or whatever, they're relying on income through their space, through their venue hire. So I would say it is important when you're putting that budget together that you ask for core running costs. And when I say core running costs, I mean things like rent. I mean, any costs associated with developing your organization. So, for example, if you wanted to pay a graphic designer to design a annual report, for example, or you wanted to improve your monitoring system, you wanted to carry out a impact evaluation of your organization. Also, you could ask for the cost of a consultant or a mentor, because in my experience, and I've been there, is when you're in a chair, the role of a chair, or you're in the role of a chief exec or a director of a small charity or CIC, it's quite a lonely place. And sometimes it's really hard. You feel stuck and you really don't know where to go next, because some decisions are really tough and some decisions can be emotionally draining as well. And um, sometimes when you're going through growth, you don't know what you don't know. And having someone who's experienced to rub ideas off against, and also to seek some guidance, is quite a huge support. And I would say it's integral to your organization's growth. So I would put that down as a core running costs in your funding application. Um, I would also say marketing costs. We do underestimate marketing costs. I have quite often. So it's really important that when you're putting the budget together, you think about your marketing costs. So, for example, logo, even like stuff that you get printed, t-shirts and things that you're advertising through your young people or through your staff. That's also part of the marketing strategy. When you're putting something in the paper, and say, for example, the local paper charges 400 and something in our area, that's a marketing cost that I would actually put in. If you feel that that paper will go to enough households and advertise your services, then that's definitely a cost you should include as a core running cost within your budget. I would say that sometimes it's the little unthought about things, like, if you wanted to design, produce something like a book, for example, that could also be part of your marketing strategy. You could have an event. You could have an event which actually advertises your services, and that event might require printing. It might require employing someone temporarily to help you with graphic design. That's also a marketing cost. So, I mean, funders are quite familiar with a wide range of things that could possibly go into that core running costs category, and they are now a lot more open, because I think they've recognized that, if you don't fund organizations core running costs, those organizations won't exist. You can fund projects, but you need the organization, you need their foundation and their infrastructure to exist in order for them to continue delivering projects. So that's more or less what I have to say about budgets when it comes to fundraising. It's not easy to put a budget together, but like I keep emphasizing, relationships and communication. It's very important that you have forge that initial relationship with the funding agency. Know someone at the other end and ask questions. If you're not sure about the budget, just be honest and just ask. You'll be very surprised if you ask how much they're willing to support you. Because when a funder receives a funding application, they could actually tell from your budget how experienced you are in putting these things together. So, I mean, they could tell anyway. So it's best that, like, instead of trying to hide and feel self-conscious about our flaws and our gaps because we're a very small organization, or, we'll get found or whatever and they won't fund us. Actually, most funders want to fund organizations that are working at a grassroots level. They just don't know how to. And the irony is that most grassroots organizations don't approach funders because they think they won't be funded. But there's always going to be a funding stream somewhere that you might be able to access some funding from. So my recommendation, my advice to you would be, don't listen to those preconceived ideas you hold. Try and speak to somebody. I mean, if you do your research properly and you have those important conversations, my experience has always been it's possible to get the funding, and the funder will actually be quite supportive. Because I think one of the things, the really, really valuable things that most of us forget is that, most grant funders, foundations and trusts, they have their set of priorities. So they might have a number of priorities, and their priority is to fund, to give the money out so that once they give their money out, the organization's delivering and helping to meet their priorities. So they really do want organizations that meet their priorities to be funded, and they want to fund those organizations and support them. But I think sometimes what happens with the smaller organizations, we make the assumption that we won't be funded, and so we don't even try. So I would say, if you're seriously thinking about putting in a bid and it's the first time you're doing it, please speak to someone, contact someone at the organization, whether it's, I could name a few organizations, but I'm trying not to because they're not paying me to advertise their trust or foundation. So why should I? Maybe in future, that's a door of opportunity that's open. But yeah, so I would say to you, if you're seriously thinking about putting in a bid, do it. And I'm going to be back next Sunday. And if you know what it is that you would really like me to cover, I would love to cover that for next Sunday session. I'm only here for about 20 minutes or so every Sunday. If you have questions, let me know. Hi, Ivy and Stella. Good to see you. Do send me those questions, and I'm happy to cover it next Sunday. Thank you very much. Have a really good, evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Bye.